Now that we know how to navigate and symbolize ArcMap and GIS data, it's now time to learn how to make a map from start to finish. And I'm going to use the example that we started with in the previous video when we symbolized population for 2015 for Lebanon County townships. We're going to use this as our starting point. So when you're designing a map, the first thing that you want to do is symbolize your data appropriately in what's called data view. After you symbolize your data, you also then want to label your features appropriately so that those who are not familiar with Lebanon County would understand which township is which. Before we move on to actual map design, I want to show you a few little tricks that you can do to make this look a little bit better. The first thing that you would likely want to do is over here in your table of contents, you have you renamed the data layer population 2015, and all the class breaks were changed to make them a little bit easier to see. This top pop underscore CY, that's the name of the field that's being symbolized. And there's really no reason to have that in this. The way that your data looks here is the way that it's going to translate to your legend on your map. So you want it to look as neat and polished and professional as possible. So with that then, I'm going to single click on that and then single click it again, and it allows me to delete it. So it just cleans that up so it looks better, and it doesn't raise any questions as to what that acronym means. The other thing that I might do has to do with my labels. And there's potentially two things that I might do here. The first is some of the labels in the smaller polygons seem to get a little bit lost because they're extending over boundaries, or they're in like Lebanon, that's symbolized in a dark blue, so the black over that is a little bit more difficult to read, but the black up in this area is not difficult to read. And one thing that you're going to find is finding an appropriate color for your labels sometimes can be hard when you're labeling different colors in the background. So one trick that you can do to counter that is to put what's called a halo behind your labels. To add a halo behind them, we come into our labels tab, and we click on the symbol option, and then we click edit symbol. And the very last tab here is called the mask tab. We click that, select halo, and you can see what happens. It puts a white background, but you can change that white to any color that you wish, and it makes it a size 2. I'm changing that to a 1 because I just want a slight halo on that, and then I can hit OK, OK again, and once again. And now we have a halo around those labels so that they pop a little bit more. And even sometimes the halos make it look not as nice or attractive as we would like, but it though makes the labels a little bit more readable. So that's a little trick when you are having difficulty making your labels easy to see for your audience. The other thing has to do with the placement of labels and moving them around. If I click my tool and then try to click on any one of these, notice that you can't click on any of the labels, so they're not movable. And that can be problematic, especially in areas where we just don't necessarily like where the label might be. So what we can do to change the location of labels is we can right-click on our data, and if you remember, we labeled our features by going to Label Features, but underneath there's an option called Convert Labels to Annotation. This makes your labels clickable text, which allows you to move them wherever you please. So we want to convert our labels to annotation. We select in the map, and then Convert. And then if we click on our arrow tool again, and let's just say we want to move Jackson. Notice that it has a blue dotted line around it, which indicates that it's selected. We can move that to wherever we might like. So any of these labels that you're not necessarily happy with the location, you can put them wherever you want. Now, something that happens when you convert to annotation, and you have to be careful of this, make sure you have your label symbolized the way you want before you convert to annotation. Once you convert to annotation, the link between the annotation and label is broken. So like if I would come in here and decide, hey, I want my labels not to be black, I want them to be hot pink, I select that. But notice that that doesn't take effect on this because this is now annotation, not labels. And it's not that big of a deal if you change your mind. What you could do if you decided, hey, they have to be hot pink, you can go in and select all your labels, just kind of like drawing a box around like how I just did. They're all selected. You can delete them and then just go back to label features, and it will be labeled in that style that you then changed to. And then again, if you want to move these around, you would have to convert it to annotation. And I'm going to change that back to a color that's not so hard on the eyes. So now we're back to our map. So once we have our map symbolized and labeled as we wish, that's when it's time to move into what's called layout view. And we haven't spent any time in layout view yet. We've been in what's called data view. We can toggle back and forth between data view and layout view by going to our view menu and then going to layout view. And then if you want to come back to data view, you just go back and forth that way. Or a much easier way is down here at the bottom where we have data view and layout view. I'm going to go to layout view. And notice that my map is added in here, and mine happens to be really small because I was messing around a little bit beforehand. Yours, when it gets added, is going to be a little bit larger than this. So the first thing that we want to do before we start placing elements on our map, we want to set our paper size and orientation. And the orientation is often chosen based on the orientation of your data. And Lebanon County tends to be a little bit more problematic because it's kind of on a diagonal, which means that it's not perfect for portrait, nor is it perfect for landscape. So we might have to fuss a little bit to see which one might work a little bit better. But to make your paper size selections and your orientation selections, we go to the File menu and then we go to Page and Print Setup. And again, it is a good practice for this to be the first thing you do when you get into layout view. I know it's very tempting to start adding titles and all this old cool stuff, but you'll thank yourself for taking the time to set this up immediately. So first thing you want to do is select your printer. In here, and the printer is really important because that actually selects what your margins are going to look like. And each printer has different margins, so even if you have two printers that you might be printing 8.5 by 11 on, they might look different in here. So select what you want and then select your paper size and orientation. I'm going to try landscape first. I'm just kind of out of curiosity. And then I'm going to hit OK. Something to realize is that this doesn't automatically adjust with your paper changes. So sometimes you have to resize and so forth. So this light gray line that you see is your margin. Everything has to be inside of that margin. You cannot put anything directly on top or it will not print out. So keep everything within there. So what I'm going to do is resize my data to fill in this space. And notice it has those blue sizing handles at each of the corners and each of the sides. And I'm just going to stretch it out so that it fits within that light gray line. And now it does, and you're probably thinking, oh, that's terrible, that looks ugly. And it does, because our data is not really zoomed in. To zoom to the extent of the data layer that we're using, you can right-click on your data layer and go to Zoom to Layer, and it pops it in nice and tight. So now we're really able to see the data, and I think actually landscape might be a really good choice for Lebanon County. So now we have our data positioned, and it's not to say that we might not reposition it a little bit later once we start adding elements, but we have the general position of it worked out. So now it's time to add the major map elements. When we are in Layout View, all of these things under the Insert menu are available to us. If we are in Data View, you're going to notice that not all of those things are available to us, because we can't add these map elements in Data View. You have to be in Layout View. So if a common question is, well, why can't I see everything? You're likely just in the wrong view. So now that we're in Layout View, the first thing that I want to add is my title. So the title of your map should be the theme of your map. And the theme of this map is a total population. So I'm going to call it total population. And I'm going to be sure to put the year along with it because you need that information to just know for sure the time period and the currentness of the data. So I hit OK, and it adds it in the default size and font, which is Arial 16. If you turn on your draw toolbar, and likely when you first start it won't be on, so if you remember, go to customize, toolbars, and then draw, and it will turn it on. This is my draw toolbar. I'll yank it off so you can see what tools I'm selecting. When an element is selected, as you see here, you can then work with its properties on your draw toolbar. For instance, perhaps you want a different font than Arial. Perhaps I'm going to take this one, Fang Song, and then you might also want it to be larger. And I'm going to think about maybe a 28, and then you might want to bold it. So again, the title is your theme of the map, which in this case is total population. Your subtitle then would be the geography of where this map is happening, and in this case it would probably be, you could call it Lebanon County or Lebanon County Townships. So again, we would just go to Insert Title, and it's actually just going to reinsert the title that we already have. Then you can double click that and change that to Lebanon County. And again, we can change the properties by going to our Draw toolbar, selecting Fang Song, and then selecting the size that we want. And what I generally do is I bold the title, but don't bold the subtitle, so that the theme of the map has a little bit more prominence over the geography. Once I have both of those things, what I'm going to do is select them both by clicking on one first and then holding my Shift key to select the other. What that allows me to do is to center them so that they're properly aligned. So if I right-click, then I can go to Align and then Align Center, and it just aligns them nicely. Also, once I have things completely, I can then right-click and then group them together so that they work together as one element rather than two. So I tend to do that a lot because it's a lot less movement you have to make if you decide to change things up. And what you'll notice too is now you can even resize this by pulling the sizing handle back and forth. So if I just would pull this a little bit, notice that it just gets larger. So it gives you some control once you make that grouping. Now, one last thing before I go on, I went to the Insert Title when I added the subtitle. Another thing I could have done to save some time, and it actually is sometimes can be significant in terms of saving time, I could have just copied my title and then did a paste, and it would have had the same new font that I selected, and I already would have had changes in size. So there are a lot of cheats that you'll slowly start learning about just to make yourself a little bit more efficient in the product. But now that we have the title and subtitle, the next element we're going to add is probably the easiest one of all, and that's the north arrow. And to do that, we could just go to Insert North Arrow, and you can see you have a variety of options available to you. Because this is a very simple, basic map, I would go with a north arrow that also emulates that style. This is not an ornate map, so I wouldn't go and select something that's really fancy schmancy, because it really just doesn't go with the tone of the map that you have. So I'm just going to select the top one and hit OK. And then I'm going to tuck that away in a corner somewhere, and I might come back to that and revisit its location, but for now, just kind of keeping it out of the way. North arrows should be small and subtle. They don't have to take up a big portion of your map. Oftentimes, new map makers tend to make them very large, like this, and that's just not necessary. So I would encourage you to keep those small and subtle tucked away in a corner. By default, an arc map, up is north, so that will, always be the case when you add your north arrow. Unless you rotate your data frame, then the north arrow will adjust accordingly to that. And we'll learn how to shift the data frame around in another lesson. So now that we have the north arrow, we now need a scale bar, and these can be some of the for new map makers, these can be a little frustrating. Even for map makers that have used it a lot, it can be aggravating. But again, just as in the north arrow, you wanted to pick something that goes along with the tone of the map that you're building, the same goes with the scale bar. And I'm just going to go with a simple one because it's nice and simplistic. You select the one that you want, and then you go to Properties. In here, you have to select how you want it to look and what your units are and so forth. So the first thing that you really should think about is, okay, what units are appropriate for the geography that I'm looking at? And I would say for Lebanon County, miles is appropriate because we want a scale bar in miles. Something in feet would be completely useless because it's just, this is much too large to really use feet for. Using feet is more for a very like a smaller geography. Using miles is more appropriate for this. So before I make that, one thing that's very helpful to know, if you don't know it already, is to know about how far across your geography is. So like in Lebanon County, if you go for just kind of from end to end, you see it's about 26 miles. Knowing that can be helpful for establishing your division values. So when I go to my scale bar, select my favorite, hit Properties, select your division units, and then you have to select how many divisions and subdivisions you want your scale bar to have. And if you look over here at this one's probably the easiest to see it on. A division, the division on here is 100 feet or 100 miles. So 0 to 100, 100 to 200. And then that first interval is subdivided into 3 subdivisions. So that's what this means, is like how many divisions do you want and how many subdivisions do you want. And also notice that your division value, you can't change it. So like if you wanted this to be, say, 5 miles, you have no choice in the matter. This is going to select it automatically for you. And where you can change that is down here with the when resizing. And the option that I tend to use pretty much exclusively is adjust width, because it gives me control over all 3 of these things, and I like having that because I want them to look as I want them to look rather than how ArcMap tells me they want it to look. It will put a value in there that is going to be wacky. Obviously 7,200 miles is not going to work as an interval for us, but since it's like 26 miles, I would say maybe 5 mile intervals. I'm going to start with 3 and 2 to see how that works. Hit apply. You get a little bit of a preview here, though it's very difficult to see. Hit OK and OK again, and it adds my scale bar for me. You're not stuck with it if you decide, oh, this is terrible. I really maybe want this to be 1 subdivision or one division smaller, you can just double click on it and get back into the properties and kind of play around with those values in there. But sometimes, making sure you just select the appropriate units, using the adjust width option so you have control over all three of those things, and then just make it some picks here based on what you think might work. If it doesn't, not the end of the world. You just click and just play around with numbers until you get it to look how you want. I'm going to keep it like that. So I'm just going to keep that there for now. Probably going to move that in a minute. And the next element that I'm going to add is the legend. And if you remember, it's going to show up as it looks here in our table of contents. So I'm going to go to Insert Legend, and this is telling us what map layers are in our legend. This is a simple map, so you're only going to see one. When we start making more complicated maps, you're going to see multiple data layers. You can set the number of columns you want in your legend. One column makes it look like that. If you want it to be like a horizontal legend, you would probably pick 5 columns so that you have that horizontal look, but I'm just going to hit Next. You can title your legend. I'm just going to keep it called Legend. You can change the properties of it. Because in my title I used a Fang Song font, I'm going to be consistent and use that in my legend, because you don't want to have too many font types on a map. It starts looking messy and just out of sorts, so being consistent is important. You could put a border, background, and drop shadow behind your legend. On a map such as this, where the legend is going to be going into an empty white space, I don't see a need for a border and a background to put it in a box, because it just it doesn't have to pop off of anything. If I'm putting a legend over top of a map element, then I would use that. So I'm going to skip that. And I'm just going to power through until I hit finish. And then here we have our legend for things. So now that we have the main map elements, I'm going to add a couple others in a second. I'm going to start now with the organization of the map. One thing I'm going to do in my tools toolbar is I'm going to grab that pan tool and just slowly kind of pan that over a little bit so I get a little bit more room here so I can place my legend in this area. I'm going to move that like there, and I kind of like to have all my map elements together so there's a one-stop shop for all the interpretation pieces of the map. Sometimes it works well, sometimes it doesn't. And I could get so fussy about this. Which I won't do. But you get the idea how things are kind of put together and organized so that you can interpret the map. And once you have those positioned as you want, one other thing that you might want to add is insert text, and to put your name, the date, and even if you want to remember where this file is saved on your computer, you could put the file path or the name of the project, but I'm going to opt not to do that. And then I'm going to tuck that away in the corner. This is where you might want to even put produced by South Anvil Township Department or something along that line. So once you have your map finished and done, and I would probably still mess with this for a few more minutes, but for the sake of demonstration, what we would want to do is save our project. So we would go to File, Save As, and we would save this in an appropriate location. One of the things in GIS that starts to become very important is data management, and there will be a separate video on that to give you some hints on best practices for data management. But for now, I'm going to place this on my desktop so I can retrieve it. And I'm going to call it Lebanon _population. And you notice that I don't put any spaces in my document names. In GIS, spaces in file names is not a good thing. So you'll have to get over that habit if that's something that you do frequently. You hit save, and it saves it as an MXD file. And let's say you want to share this map that you just made with a colleague in another office, or you want to just show it to somebody, you want to print it out, and so forth. The best thing to do is to save it as a PDF. We just saved it as a .mxd. If you email that .mxd to your colleague in a township across the county, they're going to open up that MXD, and because they don't have this data on their hard drive in their office, it's just not going to open for them. So the best thing to do would be to PDF it so that it's easily shareable. So to do that, you go to File, Export Map, and you actually have a lot of options in terms of what you can export it into, and they all have their pros and cons to them. But when we get here, we can select PDF. Notice the other file formats that are available. Probably the most popular besides PDF is JPEG. JPEGs are good if you're going to be inserting your map into like a PowerPoint presentation or something, or a Microsoft Word document. That's what you want it in. If you do select as a JPEG, make sure your resolution is at least 200 dpi. The default is 96, and that is really a pixelated image. For PDFs, I would say a similar 200 to 300 is probably good, so that you have a sharp, crisp map. You hit save, and it's going to export the map. You can kind of see the progress down here at the bottom. When the PDF is done exporting, it's not going to open, and many of us are used to, when we PDF a Microsoft Word document, a PDF automatically opens of it. It's not the case in ArcGIS. So what you want to do when you're done PDFing it, go to the location where you saved it, double click it to verify that everything went to plan. Sometimes things don't export properly, and you think it is, and you send it without looking. It's always a good practice to look at the map to make sure everything exported the way that you had hoped. When we start making some more complicated, bigger maps, PDFs have this nasty habit of moving elements around on you, especially scale bars and north arrows. That can be a very frustrating thing, but for simple maps like this, it's usually not an issue. So that's the map design process from start to finish. As you can see, it's relatively simple when you're doing a simple map. In upcoming videos, I will be showing you some more tips and tricks in map design when we start making more complicated maps, some things that you can do to make your maps look really sharp, polished, and professional.